Hey, so for episode 21, some people might not like it when I nitpick the show, but this is the first thing that we kind of have to point out. We see this, what looks like a barrack or garrison point for soldiers, inside the actual imperial palace. In reality, although being the imperial capital, Beijing was well guarded by different garrisons. There weren't any specific soldiers garrisoned or stationed inside the imperial palace. It kind of makes sense if you think about it. The imperial palace was literally the emperor's home. You don't want soldiers living inside your house. So what happened was that ancient Beijing actually consists of an inner imperial palace, inner city, and then an outer city. After the rise of the last dynasty, they actually added a southern part of the city. Although city was only the area that's walled inside ancient city walls at that time, you had people living beyond the city walls. So most of the military barracks and garrisons were stationed outside the city wall. Some of them were stationed in southern city later on, so they would have been inside the outer wall, but not the inner wall, and certainly weren't inside the imperial palace. Although what gave the animator and creator this idea was probably the fact that either they've been to Forbidden City in Beijing nowadays, or they've searched up images and photos of Forbidden City nowadays. Right now, Forbidden City is right due north of Tiananmen Square, which actually is where the Chinese legislature is also working. And in that square, you actually have a flagpole. They do flag raising every day. So essentially, the ceremonial guards who does that are stationed inside the inner wall of the Forbidden City because that's the closest place with any built-up structure, and there weren't really any other place to put them. The part with Mao Mao and the crack doctor, that was a little bit more accurate and made a little bit more sense, except for the fact that, once again, in this world, it seems that paper were unnecessarily too expensive. Granted, paper wasn't as cheap as they are nowadays. Back then, it's not a luxury product. It wasn't a luxury product back then. It was still a household item. It's just that it's more expensive. If you think about it, the difference between paper nowadays and paper back then was probably the difference between firewood nowadays and like wooden cutting board nowadays. Most people can afford to buy a wooden cutting stool or a cutting board, right? But you don't buy those which are made of wood and then burn it as heating or firewood. So that's affordable, but it's not affordable in that sense. Most people with a decent income who lives inside the city limits, they can afford to use paper. And there wasn't really a period in Chinese history where paper was used alongside bamboo slits. It started off with bamboo, and the Chinese used to write things on bamboo, and then with the invention of paper, they really just moved away from bamboo and moved down to paper. There wasn't any period where they actually used two at the same time or interchangeably, because paper was rare but not that rare. But it doesn't seem like it's the case in this show. They probably just want to add a uniqueness to it because the bamboo-bound book was something that's more or less unique to China. With that said, their way of serving snacks on paper, that's actually a common practice. It's still somewhat a common practice in more traditional snacks that you put a layer of paper beneath so that they don't stick to other utensils, they don't stick to each other, and generally speaking, you use the lower quality paper for that. It doesn't seem like a waste because the lower quality paper, they probably weren't used for writing or anything like that. If we look at the process of paper making a little bit, we can understand a little bit more why it was a big issue and how Mao Mao actually solved that issue. Paper is essentially made of plant fiber, right? Boiling up plant matter into a mush and then usually using a rake to pick up the plant fiber so that they form up into one layer. And the whole idea behind the paper being tough enough that you can write on is that they're interlaid plant fiber against one another. And the fact that cows and oxen and buffalo, they're essentially ungulates, and they eat plant matter, they eat grass for sustenance. Grass is actually notoriously hard to break down. The plant fiber inside generally is hard to digest. If you're a human, you generally won't actually digest it. It's not going to be absorbed by your body. But since buffaloes, oxen, cows, they actually eat this for survival, they had an enzyme in their stomach which actually breaks down the plant fiber so that they can absorb it. And being an even-toed ungulate, they actually regurgitate, essentially throwing up their stomach content into their mouth and chew them again. During this process, some of the enzymes will be brought up to their saliva and to help them break down plant matter. Now, if you have a cow or a buffalo drinking from the same well that you use for paper making, some of the saliva of the cow will unavoidably drop into the water source along with these enzymes. And these enzymes that breaks down plant fiber will start breaking down paper fiber, essentially making them not tough enough for a lot of purposes. If you want to write on it, you don't want them falling apart. You generally want paper to be a little bit tougher, so whichever stuff you write on it gets to be kept permanently. And then we move on to the main focus of this episode, which we had a hook from last episode as well, is the rumor that one of the three quote-unquote princesses are gonna be bought off. It's worth mentioning a little bit about this process and how money works, because the number they've thrown around in this show probably mean very little if you didn't know about it. I've actually done some research and was able to convert whichever stuff they mentioned in the show into more or less modern money in some currencies, so that maybe you guys can understand a little bit better. Now let's start off with buying off a top courtesan, essentially in the entire country. Since they're in the nation capital, it's usually assumed that they're top of the top. We did have a record of courtesans being bought off in end of Ming Dynasty around year 1600s, and we know about how much that'll cost. At the turn of 1600s, Chinese generally used silver as hard currency. Legally speaking, the actual coins were the legal currency of that time. But because of the abundance of silver, people really just started using that as a currency. Mainly also due to inflation, since each coin wasn't really worth that much anymore, and you can carry a lot more value by using silver. The fact that they weren't using gold was that China actually didn't have a lot of precious metal reserve by comparison to a lot of other regions. Even the silver was actually mostly coming from South America and the whole trade between Spain and Portugal and China. And silver was essentially measured in teal, so there was a record of 8 of the most famous courtesans in 1600s, and their essential purchasing price at around 3,000 teals per person on average. These courtesans had different kind of endings. Some of them were very happy endings. They were able to be essentially bought off by a well-off government official and live off their day basically in a quiet and peaceful life. But some did end up like Mao Mao's mom, essentially, not being able to provide for herself, eventually catching a STD and died from it. So you had a whole range of fate in between. And there were stories similar to what's been kind of set up here between Li Haku and Piring, that a low-ranking government official or someone aspiring to become a government official actually falling in love with a courtesan who actually supported him, and then him being able to obtain a high enough position, actually buying her off. So that was recorded in history. Now let's just keep in mind that purchasing price for a courtesan like Piring, historically speaking, was about 2,500 to 3,000. Whereas in the show, Mao mentioned it at around 10,000. We can use that to convert the currency value in the show, which just means that whichever the show mentions, if you divide by 4, then that's roughly similar to what would have been the equivalent amount in history. And Li Haku's salary essentially is mentioned at around 1,000. If we divide that by 4, then it's 250. We had historic records of how government bureaucrats and officials were paid back then. And for the last two dynasties in particular, they weren't really paid very well. A lot of bureaucrats and officials started embezzling money and engaging in corruption and everything, mainly because they were paid so poorly. In history, they would have been paid for around 100, whereas Li Haku's salary was around 250, so about twice as much. We also didn't see any potential that this empire is in trouble and there was rampant corruption. So let's just assume that unlike the last two Chinese dynasties, they actually paid their officials well enough. Before this period, the first kind of payment for government officials was actually rice. You were paid in essentially food, like a lot of food, staple food like rice. But then you had to sell it and then convert it into money and then use that money for everything else. Then gradually, at around 6th century or so, officials were paid mostly in coin that were issued by the government because back then, silver was worth a lot more than they were later on. But at 1600, year 1600-ish, Li Haku was making equivalents of 250 taels of silver. And each tael of silver at that time roughly converts to about $700 in Chinese money nowadays, given their purchase power and everything else. This wasn't my assumption. This was actually calculation done by Chinese historians to give us a relative amount of how much people earned back then. If you want the amount in US dollars, then exchange rate between Chinese dollars and US is 7-1. So in terms of actual exchange rate worth, 700 Chinese dollars was like 100 US dollars. However, this estimate was based on purchase power, and a lot of things in China are cheaper than they are in the US. So in terms of purchase power alone, the money might worth a little bit more, and it's not a really good equivalence if we just use the exchange rate. For example, vending machines in China usually sell Coca-Cola, like actual Coca-Cola, at about half the price as they would in, say, America. So you can't really use a exact exchange rate for that. With that said, and with that conversion, essentially one tael of silver then is equivalent to $230 US nowadays. If you want that in Japanese yen, then $1 US is worth about 150 Japanese yen right now. And you can do the conversion that way and figure that out. Since Li Haku's salary is mentioned at 1,000, which we learned that 1,000 in the show is equal to 250 in 1600s China, then his salary in terms of Chinese money nowadays would have been 117,500 per year. And now if we take that and convert it into how much that's worth in terms of US dollars, he's making about 60 grand a year in terms of salary. So $60,000 US a year. Not as good as people would assume, mainly because people are much richer nowadays, actually. We just have more things to spend on. That's why we seem poorer than before. $60,000 salary a year isn't bad. For someone in their 20s, it's like livable. But then if we look at Pyring's purchase price, then it's set at 10,000, which basically just means it's 2,500. Then if we convert that into Chinese dollars and US dollars, then we're looking at $1.17 million Chinese and about 600,000 US dollars. Not something that people can readily afford. Especially if you consider that they really didn't have banks. You couldn't take out a loan back then. There wasn't any other way to really make a quick money. With that said, it's not something that's totally unobtainable. Of course, that just makes the scene where Jinshi's actually offering him 20,000 seem a lot more significant. Considering if we take 20,000, actually convert that into modern money, that's $3.5 million in Chinese dollars nowadays and $1.2 million US. So Jinshi is casually offering this guy $1 million. If anything, that might help you put the scene into perspective a little bit. Now, of course, Li Haku turned that down, and opted to actually work for it himself. Now, given the fact that he's only paid for about 1/10 of the asking price, unless if pirating helps him out, there's only one other way that he could maybe obtain the amount of money, and that is getting a nobleman title. Generally speaking, Chinese bureaucrats and officials weren't really paid that well historically. They were paid enough so that they would survive better than most people, but they weren't paid like extremely well. However, there were people that were paid extremely well, and those were the noblemen. And generally speaking, unlike, say, Europe, Chinese noblemen were usually given the title. They kind of weren't really born into it, unless if they were related to the emperor and imperial family. And these kind of titles usually were on a reduction scale, so your son won't be able to inherit the same title as you, unless otherwise specified. It gives an incentive for people to work hard because a nobleman title will grant you additional money every year. And that's actually quite a lot of additional money. A lowest ranking nobleman title will probably give you about half the salary of a low ranking official, someone lower than Li Haku, on top of whichever money you make from your job. And other than money, you were usually also given things like goods. So you were given this amount of money, and you were also given probably something equivalent to this amount of money's value in staple food, for example, rice again, and other kind of grains, luxury fabric such as silk. And these were significant because if you actually had these, you don't have to purchase them using the money you've earned. So it's like giving you more extra money. And if you have left over, you can sell them and potentially get more money. So a nobleman title would have been something that gives you way more than what your actual job in the bureaucracy will give you. And given that Li Haku's a military officer, he can most likely obtain a nobleman title by performing well enough in battles. Generally, people would have been rewarded one. And it depends on how big a contribution, how well he performed. If he was given a mid-ranking nobleman title, then potentially he can see his income triple. So right now, if we're going by Mao Mao's estimation, it takes 10 years of Li Haku's salary to actually pay for pirating. But given that if he actually is able to obtain a title, you can divide that by 3, then it's only going to be 3 years. And the whole fact that Li Haku opted to actually work for it, and them showing the tree and the flower, which is a plum flower, really kind of symbolizes a personality. Plum flower only blooms in the dead of winter, when every other kind of plant generally were dormant. It symbolizes resilience, actually very high and desired quality in China. Now, with all the virtuous qualities aside, I think the most significant bit of humor actually comes from Mao Mao checking out Li Haku naked. To be honest, depends on the time period in Chinese history, that usually wouldn't happen. And given Jinxi's position and how Li Haku is still embarrassed, it's still not a normal thing to do in this world. It's just that Mao Mao grew up in a brothel. She probably isn't normal and doesn't really adhere to people's usual understanding of normal. And it really depends on the time period. In some time period, the divide between men and women was so strict. If a girl actually exposes enough skin to a guy, then she'd have no choice but to marry him. So, although this is a gender reverse role, given the time period, if this actually happened in certain strict time period, Jinxi could have both of them executed for that. It went from being that bad to being a lot more lenient. It really depends on time periods. But that aside, we have Mao Mao essentially striking this pose, although it's just for zooming into Li Haku's body and everything. It kind of reminded me of another similar kind of pose by an unrelated person. And it's by Hashimoto Kana, and she's actually not really related to this show per se. She's not a voice actress for Mao Mao. That will be Yuki Aoi. But Hashimoto Kana is a famous Japanese actress who actually starred in quite a decent amount of live-action adaptation of anime and manga works. And that pose kind of reminded me of one pretty famous photo of her when she was 14, I think. And it's kind of funny if you think about it, because it's not out of the scope of reality that if they actually decide to adapt this into a live action show, then there's a good chance they'd actually get her to play Mao Mao. Because since she played so many other anime or manga adaptation protagonists, it's not out of scope of reality, really. And when we see Lee Haku and Mao Mao actually writing to Pyring presumably at the same time, this is one part where the show has done very well, although people probably wouldn't notice unless if they know why. We see both Lee Haku and Mao Mao writing, although writing on bamboo slits, that's not the case when you had paper readily available, but the way they're holding the brush, which Chinese and Japanese both traditionally use brushes to write. The way they're holding the brush is actually a distinct Chinese style, similar to how you'd hold a chopstick but only vertical, whereas Japanese tend to hold the brush in a more, say, like pen or pencil kind of way, in between your thumb and index finger. So in the show, they actually show them writing in a distinctively Chinese script. So that's some very good attention to detail right there.